we are gonna talk about this book that I read, and it was pretty interesting. As you can see, race differences in intelligence, and my experience through reading this book was simply that, like, it was just really an informative read. Honestly, it provided some more information, especially on the topic of the difference in races and environments and how that impacts our, I don't necessarily want to say intelligence levels, but how it impacts our IQ. And we'll talk about how the IQ was, you know, how it was done, the tests were done, and things like that. But firstly, we're gonna define, or no, we can go with what the book is about. And this book, basically the main idea of this book was simply to just give examples, and because this is, yeah, like as I'm just looking at right now on the title, it says this is a definitive study. Yeah, by the man who did more than anybody else to collect the extensive data. Because this was basically just a lot of studies into just one huge, well, it wasn't huge, honestly, but just one book filled with just knowledge on intelligence. And that was really, that's really the main idea. Just a book on intelligence in race, of course, and the differences between the races. So we can start with what was being said, and we can go in. I like going in chronological order with what the book says, simply because that's the easiest way I remember it, or that's the way I remember it, I should say. So the the first thing they talked about was what is intelligence, and the definition that they gave was, and don't quote me on this, because I do this just off my head now. But the definition they gave was an individual who has the ability to progressively complete harder and harder tasks. So, and they said that this was near universally accepted, and I accept it too, because when you think of math and things like that, it progressively gets harder, and it doesn't even necessarily get harder, because with math, basically all you have to do is plug the numbers into the formula, and it just basically works out on its own. So it doesn't really get harder. It just, there's usually more steps involved with the harder you get, like with the quadratic formulas and things of that in algebra 3-4. That's more steps than just doing regular algebra. At least if the algebraic equation is just normal. But we know what intelligence is now. Now, what is the definition of race? And this is one that this is a question that I really wanted to know. What's the difference between me and then necessarily an Asian? Or what's the difference between me and an Anglo-Saxon, a European, and things of that nature? And or so the answer that they came up with was basically races are just like subspecies, and they're not even subspecies because we're all part of the same species. But because we were in different areas, and the early Homo sapiens, they separated. And I read this in the book that I was gonna do a video on, but I did not make the video on that book. So basically, just know we separated throughout the whole world, and we were already basically populated the whole world. I would say around 12,000 years ago. So America was founded 15,000 years ago, supposedly, and this is all you know, just based off the archaeologists and anthropologists. But I forgot what anthropologists are called when they're in the field and they look at bones and things. So we were already across the globe basically since agriculture started. Basically, is what I'm telling you. So then after 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 I'm done, well, I'll just finish talking about, we're basically subspecies, but in a sense of our environment. So like, there's pretty much no difference between me and an Asian, except for obviously our looks and our environment. And our genetics are slightly different, and the genetics are also based on the environment that we were in, or the environment our ancestors were in. And we'll get into that later too with IQ and things. So we're pretty much gonna start with the people that they showed. And the first people they showed were Europeans. Hey, these people are supposed to be, supposedly, they're supposed to be the smartest people around. And unfortunately, newsflash, they're not. Now, they are relatively smart. And by relatively, I mean they're the second smartest people in the world by race, of course. So the the Europeans, their average IQ was around 100, which is, basically normal. They are normal, but they're compared to everyone else, they're intelligent. But compared to what the IQ scale says, they're pretty much normal, or normally intelligent for a human being. Especially since other animals, when they take IQ tests, their scores are, just negligible. Like it's no point to even look at it, pretty much. Well, there probably are some differences between some smart species and some species that are just unaware of everything, but that's beside the fact. So the next people they talked about was the sub-Saharan Africans, and these people were, if I remember correctly, around 60, 66. I would like to say 66 IQ, and IQ is the intelligent quotient, and we can go into define how they defined IQ. So they defined the IQ based on tests of both math, if I remember correctly, it was math, reading, and science, and also just regular, just intelligence. So, for example, they did a test about non, what was it? Non-vocal, like a non-vocal test on kind of like just to interpret things that were happening in their world. So kind of like, I don't want to say body language like, but kind of like just non-social, environment. And can you depict what is happening during a non-social environment? And do you know what to do? Oh, emotional intelligence. That's the word I was looking for. So they also depicted it from emotional intelligence and from fluid intelligence too, if you know what that is. So, so after the Africans, they talked about other African species, and well, they weren't African species, but other people who came from the same area as the Africans. And this was also interesting. He mentioned that the Africans weren't in Africa first, and well, when you think of Africans, obviously you think of Africa, but what he meant was that there was people living there, or some certain tribes in some areas, because there was probably, as I said, there were people everywhere, 10,000 years ago. We were already across the globe. But with the Africans, they killed some tribes of the people they were called Bushmen. And apart from the Bushmen, there was another one called the Pygmies. And these Pygmies and Bushmen, they are both dumber. I can't say dumber, but they both have less IQ points than the sub-Saharan Africans. And all of their living conditions were relatively the same. So that lets us know, because they're in the same area pretty much. So that lets us know that, maybe the Africans are a little more genetically favored to intelligence. And this is one thing that I pondered on, simply because, well, the Africans are, relatively dumb compared to the smart people, but, compared to these hunters and gatherers, because the Bushmen and the Pygmies, they were hunter and gatherers. They were not, agriculturally evolved yet. So, with the hunters and gatherers, oh yeah, again, they were killed, but they weren't all killed. They moved across Africa, so they went down to the south of Africa, and that's pretty much why there's people in South Africa are like another race. That's why they're not all black. People say it's because they're not in the sun. I mean, that's pretty silly. It's because they're a whole nother race there. So, so apart from that, let us know that the Africans there are a little more genetically favored to intelligence than their counterparts. So the next people that they talked about were the people in the Philippines, and if I remember correctly, these were called the Northeast Africans too. Northeast Africans and the Southwest Asians. So these people, if I remember correctly, it's Indonesia, Philippines, Iraq, Iran. So like around, it's called the Middle East, but they called it the Southern Asia, Southern Eastern Asia. I'm not sure how to pronounce how that pronunciation is, but these people, they were also in the 70s, and some of them were in the 80s. So that lets us know that some people aren't necessarily just, not everyone is going to be smart. And compared to the Europeans, these people are like no, not smart at all. Cause like 30 IQ points is a lot. Because 130 compared to 100 is a pretty major difference, especially compared in a school setting, for example. Like that can define someone who's the top of their class and someone who's just, honor worthy. So so apart from those people, we now have the smartest people yet. Just the Asians in general. And if I remember correctly, these were called the Eastern Asians. Yeah, just the Eastern Asians. And the Eastern Asians, these are the Chinese, the Hong Kongians. I'm not sure if they're Hong Kongians. The people who live in Hong Kong. The citizens of Hong Kong, the Japanese, and people around there. So these people, their IQ, the least IQ. Well, I can't say the least, but throughout all those countries, all of their IQs were over 100, and their living conditions are not better than the Europeans. So they said that if the Chinese and the Japanese, like Hong Kong right now, is very populated. Like people are living in living quarters of 6 feet, and that's if they're lucky. A lot of people are homeless there too. So it's not a good living condition. And also, I should say this book in itself was relatively old, but it still provided good information. And I know it's pretty much the same right now. I don't think that we evolved within the past 20 years. Yeah, we pretty much didn't evolve in the past 20 years. So as I was saying, their living conditions weren't that good. So if they had better living conditions, they would be even higher, at least 10 points higher than what they were. And their highest points for average of if I there was at least 20 people in each study. So the average was from one group was 130 IQ, and that is very high. Their average people is 130 IQ, and I already knew this from another book that I've read, and I posted a video on it, but I didn't speak about this topic in that video, and that was that Asian people, or I can't even say Asians. Well, yes, Asians. Their math level on average is 2 grades higher than mine, and or so. In my head, I pictured that they were already taking the AP statistics class that I want to take, and that's kind of, I can't say I feel bad about it, but it's certainly something that I know I could do better, because when it comes to learning, basically all it is just taking the material like this. With me reading books, I've learned that just to learn, all you have to do is just take in the material, and that's pretty much it. You just take in the material and you know it. So I know that I could take the class right now and do relatively good in it, simply because, as I said before, math is just you plug it in the formula. It's very simple, in my opinion, at least. Maybe there's some questions that take an hour to complete, but in my opinion, it's relatively simple. So the genetic, because the Asians, they are smart because they're genetics, and that is simply because in the past, and this is just one theory, of course, but in the past, supposedly they were living in the cold areas. In the colder areas, people who live in the cold, they have higher IQs, and that is because they have to make different clothes and just do things differently than people who live in the same area, or at least they have the same weather, like Africans. This is pretty much the same thing year round, so they don't change nothing. But when you change and adapt, that's when you grow. So let's just know that the Asians, since they changed and adapted, and they had to use needles to make all this stuff, and they were creative. Like, yeah, that lets us know they were creative. They made a lot of things, even now. Like, they created gunpowder, they created new math concepts, and they created, I don't know if they created good warfare, but, I'm guessing that they did. They probably did that too. So, so they're just genetically better simply because of what their ancestors did. So now we could talk about, is this book true? And honestly, I believe that this book is relatively true, simply because the author, he doesn't like make it biased. He just pretty much puts the information and summarizes the information. So he did a great job with this. When I think about it, he really did a great job with this. And he talked about a lot of things that, I didn't get into, like, for example, brain size and other types of intelligence, like what was another one? Spatial intelligence and just processing speed in general, reaction times. So he did like a lot of other things that I didn't even get into. But if you want to, obviously you can pick up the book yourself. So now, what's the meaning of this book? Now, pretty much what the author was trying to say again is that there are race differences in intelligence. That's the meaning behind it. There are differences in different races for intelligence. Now, that doesn't mean that if you are one of the minority classes, that doesn't mean that you can't be smart. Because, of course, with the power of neuroplasticity, everybody can be smart. That's a beautiful thing about the human brain. Anybody could be smart. And, Richard Feynman, sorry, don't quote me on this, but there's a video that I always see in my recommended about him, and the quote always says, "I used to be an ordinary student until I studied hard." And I pretty much agree with that, simply because before I read a lot of books, I was pretty much a normal kid. But until I read books, my intelligence grew, and I feel like I got a little bit better. That's pretty much it. So the meaning is, yes, you may be the minority, but trust me, you can change too. So this is the race difference in intelligence.